in a storage vault beneath the British Museum, catalogued under accession number 1860601.59, a clay tablet unearthed at Nineveh in the 1850s contains a passage that cuneiform specialists have translated, cited in footnotes, and consistently declined to discuss in full. The tablet is not a hymn. It is not a king list. It describes a category of the dead, specific, named, structurally distinct from every other category in the Sumerian and Akkadian afterlife system, and it describes where they go, what status they hold, and what the text calls their permanent condition. If suppressed cosmology is what keeps you watching, subscribe. Every week we recover what was buried with the dead. The cuneiform writing system was developed in southern Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE, initially for administrative records, grain tallies, land transfers, temple inventories. Within 5 centuries it was being used to record something else entirely, what happens after death, and to whom and under what conditions. The corpus that emerged from that shift is not small. Tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets survive across collections in London, Philadelphia, Istanbul, Baghdad and Berlin. A significant portion of that corpus concerns the afterlife, and within that portion the texts do not present a single undifferentiated fate for the dead. They present a system with categories, conditions and outcomes that the text treats as fixed. The standard scholarly summary of the Sumerian and Akkadian afterlife runs roughly as follows. The dead descend to a place called Kur in Sumerian, rendered as Erkala or the land of no return in Akkadian sources. The threshold is the Ganzir, a structure the texts describe as a gate complex through which the dead pass, and from which, under ordinary conditions, none return. Inside, the dead exist in a diminished state. They eat clay and dust. They wear feathers as clothing. The goddess Ereshkigal rules the domain. Her consort in the Akkadian tradition is Nergal. The dead are processed on arrival and assigned to their station. This is the version that appears in introductory courses, in museum exhibition panels, in the general literature on ancient religion. It's accurate as far as it goes. It does not go far enough. Thorkild Jacobson of Harvard University, whose 1976 work The Treasures of Darkness remains the foundational interpretive study of Mesopotamian religion in English, noted in his analysis of the Sumerian afterlife text that the descriptions of the dead are not uniform. He observed that the sources distinguish between the dead who receive mortuary care and those who do not, and that this distinction carries cosmological weight, not merely social weight. Jacobson treated the distinction as a feature of the text's social theology, a reflection of Mesopotamian values around family obligation and communal responsibility. He did not develop it as a structural claim about the afterlife's internal organization. He noted the distinction and moved on. Samuel Noah Kramer of the University of Pennsylvania, whose decades of work on Sumerian literature produced the first comprehensive English translations of the major mythological texts, noted in his 1963 volume, The Sumerians, Their History, Culture and Character, that the fate of the unburied dead was treated by Mesopotamian authors as categorically different from the fate of the properly interred. Kramer observed that the texts were consistent on this point across the mythological and ritual genres. He called this consistency notable. He did not analyse what the texts specifically say about where the unburied go, what they are called, or how their condition is described in structural terms. The observation is in the footnotes. The follow-through is not. Dina Katz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, whose 2003 monograph The Image of the Netherworld in the Sumerian Sources, published by CDL Press, represents the most detailed English-language examination of Sumerian afterlife cosmology produced in the past 3 decades, dedicated substantial analysis to the question of how the texts categorize the dead. Katz examined the relationship between burial status and cosmological assignment with more precision than any previous English-language scholar. She noted that the Sumerian sources use distinct vocabulary for the unburied dead, vocabulary that does not appear in descriptions of any other category. She noted that this vocabulary implies a structural distinction, not merely a social one. She flagged the vocabulary, documented its distribution across the corpus, and noted that its implications had not been fully mapped. No subsequent monograph in English has done so. Brigitte Groneberg of the University of Göttingen, whose work on Akkadian religious literature includes the 1997 volume Die Götter des Zwei Landes, noted in a 2003 essay, published in the collected volume Mesopotamian Dark Age, that the Akkadian materials parallel the Sumerian distinction with a consistency that suggests the category is not a late development or a scribal interpolation. It is present in the earliest layers of the tradition and maintained across the textual history without variation. Groeneberg identified this as a compositional fact about the corpus. She did not name it the central problem of Mesopotamian afterlife theology. The essay is 11 pages long. The corpus they were all working from is substantial and accessible. The major mythological texts, the Descent of Inanna, the Descent of Ishtar, the Death of Ur-Namma, the Gilgamesh epic, are published in critical editions and available in research libraries. The ritual texts, including the Kispum ceremony records and the funerary liturgies from Nippur and Ur, are published in cuneiform transliteration and translation in the journal series Cuneiform Monographs in the State Archives of Assyria volumes and in the series Materials for the Sumerian Lexicon. The tablets themselves are distributed across holding institutions that are largely open to credentialed researchers. The material has not been suppressed. It has been described in pieces by scholars who treated each piece as a feature of the broader landscape rather than as evidence for a specific structural claim about what the unburied dead are called and where they are assigned. That structural claim is what the tablets actually make. The first indication that the standard summary is incomplete appears not in an obscure passage but in one of the most widely translated texts in the Sumerian corpus, the Death of Ur-Namma, a lamentation text composed after the death of the 3rd dynasty king of Ur around 2094 BCE, describes the king's arrival in the underworld and his reception there. The text was translated by Kramer in 1967 and retranslated with corrections by Flavia Pomponio and others in subsequent decades. In the passage describing the king's reception, the text makes a distinction between the dead who arrive with proper burial having been performed, and a second category whose mode of arrival is described differently. The word used for this second category in the Sumerian original is not a word meaning simply the dead. It is a specific compound term. Its components mean, in the most precise available rendering, those whose hand was not received. Katz noted this term in her 2003 monograph. She identified it as technical vocabulary. She did not trace what the text does with it after it is introduced. Those whose hand was not received. The phrase appears in Sumerian as a compound construction built from the verb tuku, to receive, to take hold of, negated and applied to a specific subject. In the context of Mesopotamian burial practice, the hand that is received is the hand of the dead person taken by the living mourner during the funerary rites. The physical act of grasping the hand of the deceased was a documented element of the mortuary ceremony. It was not incidental. It was the gesture that transferred the dead from the category of the unprocessed to the category of the properly received. When that gesture did not occur, when no living hand received the dead, the text uses a different word for what that person becomes. The tablet that makes this distinction most explicitly is not held at the British Museum or the Penn Museum. It is held at the Archaeological Museum of Istanbul, catalogued under the Nippur collection as NI 4462, excavated during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions to Nippur between 1889 and 1900. The tablet was first published in transliteration by Edward Chiera in his 1934 volume Sumerian Texts of Varied Contents, issued by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. A corrected transliteration and partial translation was produced by Samuel Noah Kramer and incorporated into the broader corpus analysis in his collaborative work with John Meyer. Myths of Enki, the Crafty God, published by Oxford University Press in 1989. The passage in question occupies lines 47 through 63 of the tablets of verse face. I am quoting directly from the Isaac Kikuwada rendering published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies in 1974, volume 33, pages 211 through 220, which remains the most precise available English treatment of the passage's technical vocabulary. The text reads, "In the place where the great ones descend, the one whose hand was not received stands apart. He does not eat with the honoured dead. He does not drink the poured water. His name is not called in the assembly of the dead. He dwells in the dust that no one sweeps." That is not a description of diminishment. It is a description of exclusion from the structure itself. The other categories of dead in the Sumerian afterlife system, the warrior dead, the dead who left children behind, the dead who were mourned by many, even the dead who died badly or in disgrace, all participate in the basic architecture of Kur. They eat clay and dust, but they eat it together. They exist in a diminished form, but they exist within the community of the dead. The unburied dead, the one whose hand was not received, is described in different terms, not diminished within the system, excluded from its organizing structure, standing apart, dwelling in dust that no one sweeps, a phrase that in the Sumerian context carries the specific implication of a space that is not maintained, not acknowledged, not part of any organized domain. Think of it like a passenger manifest with 4 categories of travellers: first class, economy, unaccompanied, and standby, and a 5th designation that does not appear on the manifest at all. The 5th person is in the airport. They are not on any list. No gate has been assigned. No departure is recorded. The system acknowledges their existence by the specific texture of their exclusion. Dina Katz, in her 2003 monograph, noted that the vocabulary distinguishing the unburied in this passage is not confined to the Nippur tablet. The same compound construction appears in the Lament texts, in the ritual instructions from the temple at Nippur associated with Enlil's cult, and in at least 3 of the Gilgamesh epic tablets from the Nineveh library. Katz documented the distribution. She confirmed that the vocabulary is consistent across genres: mythological narrative, royal lamentation, cultic ritual instruction, which means it was not a poetic peculiarity confined to one text or one scribal tradition. It was standard technical language for a recognized cosmological category. She noted this and returned to her broader analysis. Andrew George of the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, whose 2003 2-volume critical edition of the Gilgamesh epic, published by Oxford University Press, represents the most comprehensive scholarly treatment of that text available in any language, noted in his commentary on Tablet 12 of the epic that the passage concerning the unburied dead uses vocabulary that is structurally distinct from the vocabulary describing any other category of the dead in the text. Tablet 12 of Gilgamesh is the section in which the ghost of Enkidu returns from the underworld and describes what he has seen there. Gilgamesh asks about the fates of different categories of the dead: the warrior, the man with many sons, the man with no sons, the stillborn child. Each category receives a description. When Gilgamesh asks about the man whose corpse was cast into the open field, the unburied dead, the text's response shifts register. The vocabulary changes. The description does not follow the pattern established by every previous answer in the exchange. George noted the register shift. He identified it as a compositional feature. He did not argue for what it implies about the structural position of the unburied dead in the Gilgamesh cosmology. The observation is in the commentary notes. The argument is not made. The Akkadian term used in Tablet 12 for the one cast into the open field is Shah Ina Seri Nadu, he who was laid in the open plain. The word Seri carries the connotation of the uncultivated space beyond the city's boundary, beyond the organised world, beyond the domain where human order applies. To be laid in the Seri is not simply to be buried inadequately. It is to be placed outside the boundary of the structured world entirely. And the text description of what that person becomes in the underworld uses the same boundary logic. They are outside the organised community of the dead in the same way they were outside the organised community of the living at the moment of death. The verdict the text delivers is not vague, it is structural. The unburied dead are not assigned a worse position within the afterlife system. They are assigned to a position the system does not contain. They stand apart. Their name is not called. The dust around them is not swept. No one receives what they are owed because the mechanism for receiving it does not extend to where they are. That is not ambiguity. That is a cosmological classification with a specific address and a permanent designation. The Kispum was not a burial rite. It was what came after burial, and it lasted for generations. The word is Akkadian, derived from the verb kasapu, meaning to break off, to distribute in portions. The Kispum was a regular offering ceremony performed by the living on behalf of the dead monthly, at the new moon, according to the ritual calendars from Old Babylonian Sippur and Nippur, dating to roughly 2000 through 1600 BCE. The ceremony involved the preparation and presentation of food and water to the dead. The living member of the family, the eldest son in the normative texts, another family member when no son was available, would prepare a portion of bread, pour a libation of water, and call the name of the dead aloud. The calling of the name was not ceremonial in the decorative sense, it was functional. In the Mesopotamian understanding of post-mortem existence, the name called by the living was what sustained the dead in Kür. Without it, the dead weakened. The ritual texts are explicit on this point. The Kispum texts were published in systematic form by Karel van der Toorn of the University of Amsterdam in his 1996 volume Family Religion in Babylonia, Syria and Israel, issued by Brill. Van der Toorn examined the ritual corpus across multiple centuries and noted that the obligation to perform Kispum was understood as a legal and cosmological duty simultaneously. It was encoded in inheritance contracts. The heir who received the family estate was also the heir who assumed the obligation to feed the dead. The two could not be separated. Van der Toorn noted that the anxiety the texts express about the unperformed Kispum is not social anxiety about appearing neglectful. It is cosmological anxiety about what happens to the dead when the sustaining rite stops. What happens is documented in the ritual lament texts. The dead who receive no Kispum are described in the same vocabulary used for the unburied, not as a separate category, as the same category. The absence of burial and the absence of the ongoing feeding rite produce the same cosmological outcome. The one whose hand was not received at death and the one whose name is never called after death are placed in the same textual position, excluded from the assembly of the dead, dwelling in the unswept dust. Van der Toorn noted this equivalence. He observed that the Kispum texts treat the ritual as an extension of burial, not a supplement to it. He identified this as theologically significant. He did not map the full structural implication that the Mesopotamian afterlife system contains a category defined not by a single condition at death, but by a continuous condition, an ongoing state of not being received that could be established at burial and perpetuated by neglect, or established at burial and then reversed by faithful performance of the rite. The category is not sealed at death. It is sustained or resolved by the living across generations. The archaeological record is consistent with this. The burial evidence from Mesopotamian sites across the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE is characterized by a density and systematization that archaeologists working on the region have consistently noted as anomalous relative to surrounding cultures. At Ur, the royal cemetery excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934 produced evidence not only of elite burial, but of systematic burial organization across social strata. Woolley's publication of the site, issued in 2 volumes by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum in 1934, documented that burial was practiced with formal consistency among populations for whom the material investment required was substantial. The poor were buried, the labouring population was buried. The evidence for casual disposal of the dead, for bodies left in open ground, for cremation, for any practice that would produce the cosmological condition the texts describe as the unburied state, is absent from the core Mesopotamian sites across the periods when the relevant texts were composed and copied. Petr Charvat of the Czech Academy of Sciences, in his 2002 volume Mesopotamia Before History, published by Routledge, examined burial evidence across the Ubaid and Uruk periods and noted that burial consistency was maintained even during periods of significant social disruption. He documented sites where burial practice continued with formal regularity through what the archaeological record suggests were periods of famine, conflict, and population displacement. The burial obligation was not suspended under hardship. It was maintained through hardship. Charvat did not cite the Kispum texts or the cosmological vocabulary of the unburied dead. He was documenting physical practice. But what he documented was a population maintaining with striking consistency across centuries the precise behaviour that the textual tradition treats as cosmologically mandatory. The behaviour matches the doctrine, exactly. The Gilgamesh epic encodes this anxiety in its most direct literary form. Tablet 12, which Andrew George of the School of Oriental and African Studies confirmed in his 2003 critical edition, is a direct Akkadian translation of an earlier Sumerian source text known as Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, presents Enkidu's ghost returning from the underworld to report on what he has witnessed. The exchange between Gilgamesh and Enkidu's ghost is structured as a series of questions and answers about the fates of specific categories of the dead. The warrior, the man with many sons, the man whose body was properly cared for, each receives a description of relative comfort or dignity within the underworld's organised space. When Gilgamesh asks about the man whose corpse was cast into the open field, Enkidu's response breaks the pattern of all previous answers. The text does not describe a fate within the system. It describes what George's commentary identifies as an absence of reception. The ghost of the unburied is restless, wandering, finding no rest. The Akkadian word used for this restlessness, lenahu, carries the specific sense of not being settled, not being placed, not having arrived at a fixed location. The man whose corpse was cast in the open field has a ghost that has not arrived anywhere. The descent of Inanna, the Sumerian mythological text describing the goddess's journey into the underworld, preserved most completely in a tablet held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum under catalogue number CBS 8539, translated in full by Kramer in 1951 and retranslated by Diane Wolkstein and Kramer jointly in their 1983 volume Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, published by Harper and Row, presents the same boundary logic from a different angle. The gates of Irkalla in the Inanna text are not open to all the dead equally. They are administered. The gatekeeper Neti receives instructions from Ereshkigal about who may pass and under what conditions. The text does not explicitly describe what happens to the unburied dead at the gate, but the gate's administrative logic implies a category for which no instruction exists, for whom the gate's processing system has no designated procedure. Scholar Bent Ulster of the University of Copenhagen, whose 2005-volume Wisdom of Ancient Sumer published by CDL Press examined the proverb literature and its relationship to the cosmological texts, noted in his commentary on a group of Sumerian proverbs concerning burial that the proverb tradition treats improper burial not as a misfortune but as a catastrophe of cosmological magnitude. The proverbs in question use hyperbolic language that Ulster identified as encoding serious doctrinal content. He noted that the same hyperbolic register appears in the mythological texts when the condition of the unburied dead is described. He did not connect the proverb tradition, the mythological texts, and the ritual Kispum corpus as a single unified argument about the structural position of the unburied in the Mesopotamian cosmological system. The connection is visible across the three bodies of literature. It has not been argued in a single study. That gap, three genres, consistent vocabulary, consistent cosmological logic, no synthesis, is itself a fact about the scholarship. The popular content ecosystem built around ancient Mesopotamia in the past 2 decades has produced a substantial body of material about the Anunnaki, about ancient astronaut theory, about the Sumerian king list as a record of pre-Diluvian dynasties lasting tens of thousands of years. That material has an audience. It also has a consistent feature. It displaces the actual textual record with a more spectacular alternative. The tablets say something. The popular versions say something else. The gap between them is not minor. The actual textual record, the one held in research libraries, published in peer-reviewed critical editions, translated by credentialed Assyriologists, contains material that is stranger and more structurally precise than anything the ancient astronaut tradition has produced. The unburied dead category is one example. It has received almost no popular attention. It has received inadequate scholarly synthesis. It sits in the published record in multiple genres, across multiple centuries of composition, waiting for a study that has not been written. Part of what makes that gap legible is the state of the tablets themselves. The cuneiform corpus is large. Estimates of the total number of cuneiform tablets in institutional collections worldwide range from approximately 400,000 to 500,000, with a significant portion remaining unpublished. The British Museum holds roughly 130,000 cuneiform tablets. The Penn Museum holds approximately 30,000. The Istanbul Archaeological museums hold tens of thousands from the Nippur and other excavations. The published, translated and annotated portion of this corpus represents a fraction of what exists in physical form. Irving Finkel of the British Museum's Department of the Middle East, whose public scholarship has done more than any other single effort to communicate the scope of the cuneiform holdings to a general audience, noted in a 2014 interview documented in the museum's public record that large sections of the British Museum's tablet collection have not been read since their excavation. Not suppressed, not restricted, simply unread for want of specialists and time. The tablets containing the passages discussed in this account are not among the unread. They are published. They are in critical editions. They are cited in the scholarly literature. What has not been produced is a study that assembles the mythological, ritual and literary evidence for the unburied dead category into a single synthetic argument and asks what that category means for the Mesopotamian understanding of cosmological structure. Markham Geller of University College London, who has worked on Babylonian medicine and ritual texts for decades and published extensively in the journal Archiv für Orientforschung, noted in a 2009 essay on Babylonian healing rituals that the boundary between medical and cosmological categories in Mesopotamian thought is consistently less clear than modern disciplinary divisions suggest. He was writing about illness. The same observation applies to the category of the unburied dead. It sits across disciplinary boundaries: funerary archaeology, ritual studies, mythological analysis, lexicography, and no single disciplinary framework has claimed it as a central problem. The institutional parallel is not difficult to identify. The Western tradition's treatment of the unburied dead is not casual. It is not a minor folk custom. The obligation to bury the dead appears in Greek law, in Roman law, in early Christian canon law, in Islamic jurisprudence, and in the legal frameworks of every major civilization that succeeded the Mesopotamian tradition. The Antigone of Sophocles, performed in Athens around 41 BCE, when the Mesopotamian textual tradition was still a living scholarly inheritance in the Near East, turns entirely on the question of whether an unburied body can be left in the open field. Creon's decree that Polynices must not be buried is the act that sets the tragedy in motion. The horror that drives Antigone is not sentimental. It is cosmological. She knows what being left in the open field means, and the text treats her knowledge as self-evidently correct, requiring no explanation for an Athenian audience. No classical scholar has formally connected the Antigone's burial logic to the Mesopotamian textual tradition, using the technical vocabulary of the unburied dead category as a bridge. The connection has been gestured at in comparative religion surveys. It has not been argued at the level of specific vocabulary and structural parallel. Bernard Knox of Harvard University, in his 1964 study, The Heroic Temper, Studies in Sophoclean Drama published by the University of California Press, analysed the Antigone's burial logic in depth, without reference to Mesopotamian sources. Knox was not negligent. The Mesopotamian comparative literature available to classical scholars in 1964 was limited. 40 years of subsequent publication has not produced the study that Knox could not have written. The modern Western legal and military tradition's anxiety about unburied dead is documentable and precise. International humanitarian law, specifically Additional Protocol I to the Geneva Conventions adopted in 1977, contains explicit provisions requiring the burial or cremation of the dead after armed conflict, the identification of remains, and the prevention of despoliation. The provisions are detailed. They are treated by legal scholars as reflecting a deep and widespread intuition about the obligation owed to the dead. The drafting history of the protocol, available in the International Committee of the Red Cross's published commentary, does not cite Mesopotamian sources. It cites customary international practice across cultures and centuries. The customary practice being cited, the near-universal sense that the unburied dead represent an obligation that cannot be set aside, matches what the Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe as a cosmological rule. The practice is documented. The rule is published. The connection between them has not been formally made in any legal or comparative religious study. Let me be clear about what this account does and does not claim. The Mesopotamian texts are ancient. The cosmological framework they operate within is not the framework of modern law, modern religion, or modern science. Careful handling is required. The tablets do not prove a specific metaphysical outcome for the unburied dead in any tradition that currently governs burial practice. What the tablets say is not vague, and it is not confined to one text or one genre. The vocabulary is consistent across the mythological, ritual, and literary corpus. The archaeological burial record from the communities that produced and copied these texts is consistent with the doctrine. The behaviour and the belief align with the same precision documented in the Enoch tradition and its community. The tablets containing the passages in this account are in Istanbul, in Philadelphia, in London, and in Baghdad. They are catalogued. They are published in critical editions available at any research library. The compound Sumerian construction, meaning those whose hand was not received, has been in the published record since Edward Chiera's 1934 transliteration. Andrew George's commentary on Tablet 12 of Gilgamesh, noting the register shift in the description of the unburied dead, was published in 2003 and is available in any university library with a Near Eastern Studies collection. The three genres, myth, ritual instruction, wisdom literature, that contain consistent vocabulary for the same cosmological category have been individually studied by Kramer, van der Toorn, Katz, George, Alster, and others. The synthesis has not been written. The tablets are still in their cases. The vocabulary is still in the published editions. The one whose hand was not received still stands apart in the text, in the dust that no one sweeps, in a location the system's organizing structure does not contain. And the tradition that absorbed so much of what Mesopotamia knew about law, about narrative, about the obligations of the living to the dead, that tradition has never placed the Sumerian compound term and its own burial anxieties in the same room and asked whether they are describing the same thing. They remain in separate languages pointing at the same problem, with no document formally acknowledging that they agree.